July 3rd, 1187. The twin peaks of the Horns of Hattin rose above the Galilean plateau like nature's amphitheatre, preparing to host the most catastrophic defeat in Crusader history. At dawn, nearly 20,000 Christian knights, sergeants, and infantry stood trapped without water, surrounded by Saladin's forces in the suffocating heat of a Levantine summer. The night had been hell. Saracen archers had launched fire arrows into the dry scrubland surrounding the Christian camp, creating an inferno that consumed precious oxygen and filled lungs with acrid smoke. Knights in full armour gasped for air while their horses, mad with thirst, screamed and thrashed against their tethers. The springs of Hattin, visible in the distance, might as well have been on the moon. Guy de Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, had led his entire army into this trap through a combination of pride, political pressure, and catastrophically poor judgment. Now, as the sun rose on what would become known as the worst day in Crusader history, he faced an impossible choice: stay and die of thirst, or charge through an army that had spent the night resting, watering their horses, and preparing for exactly this moment. The Crusader heavy cavalry had built their reputation on the power of the charge. For nearly a century, European knights had terrorized the Middle East with their shock tactics. Encased in mail and plate, mounted on massive destriers bred specifically for war, they formed an armoured battering ram that few Muslim forces could withstand. The charge of Frankish knights had become a nightmare in Saracen campfire stories, an unstoppable tide of steel and horseflesh that crushed everything in its path. Saladin knew this. He had witnessed it. He had fled from it. And he had spent 20 years figuring out how to stop it. What happened at Hattin wasn't just a military victory. It was the culmination of decades of tactical evolution. The moment when Islamic military doctrine finally solved the problem of European heavy cavalry. The weapon that achieved this wasn't revolutionary technology or superior numbers. It was the composite bow in the hands of professional horse archers who had perfected their craft over generations. To understand how a single volley could break a charge that had dominated battlefields for a century, we need to understand what made the Crusader cavalry so terrifying in the first place, why the Ayyubid military system was uniquely positioned to counter it, and what exactly happened on that brutal July morning when steel met sinew and European military dominance in the Levant died in the dust. The Frankish heavy cavalry charge wasn't just about brave men on horses, it was a weapons system, a military technology as sophisticated as any siege engine or fortification. At its core was the knight, a professional warrior who had trained for combat since childhood. Boys destined for knighthood began riding at age 4 or 5, handling weapons by 7, and training in full armour by their early teens. By the time they were dubbed knights, typically in their late teens or early 20s, they had spent their entire lives preparing for one thing: the charge. The knight's equipment represented the accumulated wealth of estates and vassals. A full harness of mail armour, the hauberk, contained over 200,000 individually riveted rings. Each ring was forged, punched, riveted, and polished by hand. A single hauberk took over 500 hours to construct and cost as much as a small village produced in a year. By the late 12th century, knights were adding plates of hardened steel over vital areas, increasing protection and weight. The helmet alone was a masterpiece of medieval metallurgy. The great helm, which had become standard by the 1180s, was a bucket of steel that completely enclosed the head. Ventilation holes allowed breathing but limited visibility to a narrow slit. Inside this steel prison, with only sound and peripheral vision to guide them, knights would charge into combat at full gallop. Under the mail they wore a gambeson, a quilted jacket stuffed with wool or cotton. This wasn't just padding, it was essential armour in its own right. A gambeson could stop a sword cut and absorb the impact of a blow that might otherwise break bones even through mail. Together, mail and gambeson provided protection that could turn aside most weapons of the era. The destrier, the warhorse that carried this armoured warrior, was equally specialised. These weren't the sleek Arabian horses favoured by Muslim cavalry. Destriers were massive animals, standing 16 to 17 hands high, weighing 400 to 600 pounds, with thick necks and powerful hindquarters. They were bred in northern Europe specifically for their ability to carry an armoured knight and maintain a gallop while doing so. Training a destrier took years. The horse had to learn to respond to leg commands since the rider's hands would be occupied with weapons. It had to overcome its natural flight instinct and charge directly into walls of men and horses. It had to tolerate the chaos of battle, the smell of blood, the screams of the wounded without panicking. A fully trained destrier was worth more than 10 normal horses, representing a significant portion of a knight's total wealth. The lance completed the weapon system. By the 1180s, the couched lance technique had become standard. Instead of throwing the lance or wielding it like a spear, the knight held it tucked under his arm, braced against his body. The entire weight of knight and horse, moving at 30 miles per hour, concentrated behind a steel point no wider than a finger. The physics were devastating. A knight and destrier together weighed nearly a ton. At full gallop, they possessed kinetic energy equivalent to a small truck travelling at highway speed. All that energy focused through the lance point created penetrating power that could punch through mail, leather, and flesh like tissue paper. Knights had been known to skewer 2 men with a single thrust, the lance point emerging from the second man's back. But the lance was only the beginning. After the initial impact shattered lances and scattered infantry, the knights drew their swords and continued fighting from horseback. The medieval arming sword wasn't the rapier of later centuries. It was a heavy cutting weapon, typically weighing 3 to 4 pounds, designed to deliver crushing blows that could break bones even through armour. In the hands of a trained knight fighting from the height advantage of horseback, it was devastating against infantry. The real power of the Frankish charge wasn't individual knights, it was the formation. Crusader cavalry charged in tight ranks, often only a few feet separating each rider. They called it the conroys, a wedge or line of knights that presented a continuous wall of steel. This formation multiplied the shock effect. Infantry facing a charge didn't confront individual riders they could potentially dodge or evade. They faced a wall of armoured horses and levelled lances moving at them at 30 miles per hour. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine standing in a shield wall watching this approaching nightmare. First, you hear them. The thunder of hooves grows from a distant rumble to an overwhelming roar. The ground shakes. Then you see them. The sun glinting off mail and helmets, lances lowered in perfect unison, forming a steel hedge that seems to fill your entire field of vision. Your rational mind knows you should hold the line, but every instinct screams to run. Most infantry broke before contact. The charge achieved victory through terror as much as kinetic energy. Entire formations would scatter, throwing down weapons and fleeing, trying desperately to escape the oncoming avalanche of steel. Those who stood their ground died, trampled by horses, skewered by lances, or cut down by swords as the knights rode through their shattered ranks. For nearly a century, this system had dominated Middle Eastern battlefields. At the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097, a Crusader cavalry charge routed a much larger Seljuk army. At Antioch, at Jerusalem, at Ascalon, the charge had proven unstoppable. Muslim chroniclers wrote in horrified tones about the Frankish knights, describing them as demons in iron skin, as horses and men welded together into creatures of nightmare. Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian nobleman who fought against the Crusaders for decades, wrote of his first encounter with a Frankish charge. The Christian knights came at us like a wall of iron. Our cavalry fled before them like chaff before wind. I saw with my own eyes one of their warriors strike down 3 of our best horsemen with 3 blows of his sword. Their horses did not tire, their armour didn't break, their courage did not waver. To fight them was to embrace death. Muslim commanders tried various counters. They attempted to use terrain to break up the charge, but Crusader knights proved surprisingly adept at maintaining formation over rough ground. They tried to exhaust the knights with harassment, but the Frankish horses had the endurance to pursue scattered cavalry for hours. They tried to match the charge with their own cavalry, but lighter Muslim horses simply bounced off or were bowled over by the heavier destriers. Some Muslim forces tried to adopt European heavy cavalry tactics themselves, creating units of heavily armoured horsemen to match the Franks. These experiments largely failed. The infrastructure to support heavy cavalry, the breeding programs for destriers, the armour-making traditions, the training systems, didn't exist in the Islamic world. Attempts to copy European methods produced pale imitations that combined the worst of both systems, too heavy to match Muslim cavalry mobility, too light to match Crusader shock power. By the 1170s, when Saladin began consolidating power in Egypt and Syria, the Frankish heavy cavalry remained the preeminent military force in the Levant. The Crusader states, though small and perpetually undermanned, could punch well above their weight because their cavalry was simply superior in pitched battle to anything Muslim armies could field. Saladin understood he couldn't beat the Franks by copying them. He needed to find a way to neutralize the charge itself, to stop the wall of steel before it could build momentum. The answer lay in the military traditions he had inherited, in the composite bow and the horse archer tactics that Central Asian peoples had perfected over centuries. The composite bow wasn't a Muslim invention. Its origins traced back to the steppes of Central Asia, where nomadic peoples had developed it millennia earlier. But by the 12th century, Turkish and Persian craftsmen had refined the design to near perfection, creating weapons that represented the pinnacle of pre-gunpowder projectile technology. Understanding the composite bow's construction explains why it was so devastating. Unlike the European longbow, which was carved from a single stave of yew, the composite bow was built up from layers of different materials, each chosen for specific properties. The core was typically maple or other flexible wood. The belly, the side facing the archer, was covered with horn, usually from water buffalo or ibex. Horn resists compression excellently, but is weak in tension. The back, facing away from the archer, was covered with sinew, typically from deer or cattle tendons. Sinew is weak in compression, but extremely strong in tension. These layers were glued together with fish glue, an adhesive made from the swim bladders of sturgeon. The entire assembly was then shaped, reflexed, and left to cure for at least a year, sometimes 2 or 3. During this curing period, the bow was worked repeatedly, the layers bonding and the materials achieving equilibrium. The result was a weapon that stored enormous energy in a compact package. An Ayyubid composite bow was typically only 4 to 4.5 feet long, less than half the length of an English longbow, yet it could match or exceed the longbow's power. The secret was the reflex. When unstrung, the composite bow curved away from the archer, bending backward in a shape that seemed impossibly counter to its purpose. Stringing the bow required enormous effort, literally fighting against the bow's natural curve to bend it into its operating position. This stored energy meant that drawing the bow required immense strength, typically 90 to 150 pounds of force, similar to or exceeding heavy European warbows. But unlike the longbow, which had to be very long to achieve this draw weight, the composite bow's short length made it ideal for use on horseback. A mounted archer could draw and loose while controlling his horse with his legs, something impossible with a 6-foot longbow. The arrows themselves were marvels of engineering. Ayyubid military arrows were typically 30 to 32 inches long, fletched with feathers arranged to induce spin for stability. The shafts were made from bamboo or carefully selected wood, chosen for straightness and consistency. The arrowheads varied depending on the target. Against armoured opponents, armour-piercing bodkin points were used, narrow spikes of hardened steel designed to punch through mail. Against horses and unarmoured infantry, broader cutting heads caused massive bleeding. An experienced horse archer could loose 15 to 20 arrows per minute, maintaining this rate for extended periods. The effective range against massed targets was over 200 yards, with maximum range exceeding 300 yards. This meant horse archers could begin inflicting casualties long before charging cavalry could reach them. But the composite bow alone didn't make horse archery effective. The real key was the rider's skill and the tactical system built around this weapon. Ayyubid horse archers, typically Turks or Kurds, trained from childhood. A boy destined to be a horse archer learned to ride before he could walk properly, literally growing up on horseback. By age 5 or 6, he was learning to shoot from a moving horse. By his teens, he could hit targets at full gallop. The training regimen was brutal and comprehensive. Young archers practiced shooting at targets while riding at increasing speeds. First at a walk, then a trot, then a canter, finally at full gallop. They learned to shoot forward, to the sides, and most difficult backward, the famous Parthian shot that had been terrorizing armies since ancient times. They practiced shooting while their horses jumped, while turning sharply, while accelerating and decelerating. They also learned tactical riding that would seem impossible to European knights. Horse archers could control their mounts with their legs and hips alone, leaving both hands free for the bow. They could ride in loose formation, each man maintaining spacing by instinct developed through years of practice. Most importantly, they mastered the tactical withdrawal, the ability to retreat at full gallop while maintaining formation, and continuing to shoot backwards. By the time an Ayyubid horse archer reached military age, typically his late teens, he had spent over a decade perfecting his craft. He could hit a man-sized target at 100 yards while riding at full gallop. He could loose 20 arrows in a minute. He could control his horse through the chaos of battle with barely a thought. He was a weapon system as sophisticated as any Crusader knight, but built around mobility and firepower rather than shock and armour. Saladin's military reforms built on these foundations. He inherited a fragmented political landscape where local emirs controlled their own military forces. Through a combination of conquest, diplomacy, and religious authority, he unified these disparate forces under a coherent command structure. More importantly, he imposed professional standards and training regimes across his army. The core of Saladin's military power was his personal Mamluks, slave soldiers of Turkish origin who formed an elite cavalry force. These weren't slaves in the Western sense. Mamluks were military professionals bought as boys from Turkish tribes, trained intensively in military skills, then freed upon completing their training. They owed personal loyalty to the ruler who purchased and trained them, creating a force more reliable than tribal levies or feudal obligations. Saladin's Mamluks were heavy cavalry by Muslim standards, wearing mail armour and capable of engaging in close combat with swords and lances. But unlike European knights, they retained the horse archery skills of their Turkish heritage. They could fight as both missile cavalry and shock cavalry, switching roles as tactics demanded. This flexibility made them far more versatile than Crusader knights, who were committed to the charge from the moment they formed up. Supporting the Mamluks were thousands of tribal cavalry, Kurds, Turks, Arabs, each bringing their own traditions and tactical preferences. Saladin welded these diverse forces into a coherent army through standardized training and tactical doctrine. All cavalry units, regardless of origin, trained in coordinated archery volleys, in tactical withdrawals, in flanking maneuvers, in the specific tactics Saladin knew would be needed to counter Frankish charges. The infantry component of Ayyubid armies is often overlooked, but it played a crucial role. Unlike European armies where infantry were often poorly trained peasant levies, Saladin's infantry included professional soldiers. Many were archers, armed with shorter, simpler bows than the cavalry's composite weapons, but still effective against armour at close range. Others carried pole arms, designed specifically to unhorse knights or hamstring their mounts. By 1187, Saladin commanded what was arguably the most professional army in the Middle East. His soldiers trained together regularly, something almost unknown in medieval warfare. They practiced coordinated maneuvers, the cavalry learning to support the infantry and vice versa. They rehearsed specific tactical scenarios, including the one Saladin knew would be decisive, stopping a Crusader heavy cavalry charge. The tactical doctrine Saladin developed was deceptively simple in concept, but incredibly difficult in execution. Instead of meeting a Frankish charge head-on, Ayyubid cavalry would harass the knights during their approach, using mobility to stay outside lance range while pouring arrows into the Crusader formation. The goal wasn't to kill the knights through their armour, though occasionally arrows found gaps or struck unarmoured horses. The goal was to slow the charge, to force the knights to close ranks, to disrupt their formation before they could build the momentum that made them unstoppable. If the charge couldn't be stopped by harassment, if the knights maintained formation and continued to close, Ayyubid cavalry would execute a tactical retreat, the feigned flight that had been a steppe warfare staple for millennia. The cavalry would scatter, the horses galloping away at speeds the heavy destriers couldn't match. Crusader knights, seeing their enemies flee, would often break formation to pursue, exactly the mistake Saladin wanted them to make. Once the Crusader formation broke, once individual knights found themselves separated from their comrades, the Ayyubid cavalry would turn. Suddenly the fleeing horsemen would wheel about, their bows drawn, and the pursuing knights would find themselves under concentrated fire from multiple directions. The composite bows would speak, and arrows would seek the weak points in armour, the face, the armpits, the backs of knees, the horse's flanks. This tactic required extraordinary discipline and coordination. The retreating cavalry had to maintain cohesion while appearing to flee in panic. They had to judge distances perfectly, staying close enough to draw the knights forward, but not so close as to be caught. They had to turn and reform at precisely the right moment, presenting a unified front against scattered opponents. It was the equestrian equivalent of an orchestrated dance, and it took years of training to execute properly. Saladin had used variations of these tactics in previous engagements with mixed success. At the Battle of Montchizar in 1177, he had badly underestimated a small Crusader force, and his army had been routed when Raynald of Châtillon launched a surprise cavalry charge. That defeat taught Saladin crucial lessons about the importance of reconnaissance and the danger of allowing Frankish knights to achieve tactical surprise. In subsequent engagements through the early 1180s, Saladin refined his approach. He learned that the key was controlling the battlefield conditions before the fighting even began. If he could choose the ground, if he could dictate the timing, if he could force the Crusaders to fight on his terms, his tactics could work. But pitched battles where both armies deployed in formation and charged at each other still favoured the Franks. Their superior armour and shock power gave them an edge in conventional engagements. The campaign of 1187 began with Saladin assembling the largest army he had ever commanded. He called upon every vassal, every ally, every emir who owed him loyalty or favoured his cause. By late June, nearly 30,000 men had assembled in Syria. This was an extraordinary force for medieval warfare, requiring massive logistical preparation. Saladin had spent months arranging supply depots, gathering fodder for thousands of horses, ensuring his army could move and fight without foraging. On July 1st, Saladin crossed the Jordan River and laid siege to Tiberias, a Crusader stronghold on the Sea of Galilee. This wasn't a serious attempt to capture the fortress, it was bait. Saladin knew that Guy de Lusignan, recently crowned king of Jerusalem, was under immense political pressure. Guy's claim to the throne was weak, dependent on his marriage to Queen Sibylla. Many Crusader nobles, including Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most experienced military commanders in the Levant, opposed him. The Lord of Tiberias was Raymond of Tripoli, and his wife Esquiva was trapped in the fortress. If Guy failed to march to her rescue, his political opponents would denounce him as a coward. If he marched rashly and lost, well, that would solve Saladin's problems nicely. At a council of war held on the evening of July 2nd at Safaria, 15 miles from Tiberias, Raymond of Tripoli gave advice that, had it been followed, might have changed history. Safaria had good water, defensible terrain, and was positioned to block any Saracen advance toward Jerusalem. Raymond argued they should remain there, let Saladin waste men and supplies besieging Tiberias, and force him to attack them in a position of strength or withdraw. Raymond went further. He acknowledged his wife was trapped in Tiberias. He said explicitly that Saladin should be allowed to take the fortress, take his wife, take everything. "We can ransom prisoners and rebuild fortresses," he said. "We cannot rebuild this army. It is every able man the kingdom can muster. If we lose this force, we lose the kingdom." His military logic was sound. The Crusader army at Safaria numbered about 20,000 men, including a 600 heavily armoured knights, the largest field army Jerusalem had assembled in decades. But it was also the last reserve. There were no reinforcements coming. If this army was destroyed, the path to Jerusalem lay open. But Raymond's advice played into every political vulnerability Guy possessed. His opponents, particularly Raynald of Châtillon and Gerard de Riedefort, the master of the Knights Templar, immediately accused Raymond of cowardice or even treason. How could he abandon his own wife? Was he secretly allied with Saladin? Was he deliberately trying to weaken the king's reputation? Gerard de Riedefort's argument was visceral and to many nobles compelling. "We are knights. We do not hide behind walls while ladies are besieged. If we do not march to Tiberias, every noble in Christendom will mock us as cowards. Better to die fighting than live as objects of contempt." Guy, swayed by the political pressure and perhaps by his own inexperience, made the fatal decision. The army would march to Tiberias at dawn. They would force Saladin to battle and, with God's help, crush his army, as Crusader knights had done so many times before. What Guy didn't fully appreciate was that Saladin had chosen the battlefield carefully. The 15 miles between Safaria and Tiberias crossed arid plateau country with no reliable water sources. There were wells at the village of Turan, roughly halfway, but they would not be sufficient for an army of 20,000 men and thousands of horses. Once committed to the march, the Crusaders would have to reach Tiberias and the Sea of Galilee to water their forces. Saladin, positioned between the Crusaders and Tiberias, could choose exactly where to force battle. And he chose Hattin, a place where twin volcanic peaks rose above the surrounding plateau, where water was absent. where there was no terrain feature the Crusaders could use for defence. The march began at dawn on July 3rd. Immediately it became clear something was wrong. The temperature was already oppressive and would reach over 100 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. The knights, encased in metal armour over heavy padding, began suffering from heat within the first hour. Horses, burdened with armour and riders, needed water far more frequently than normal. Worse, Saracen cavalry appeared on the flanks almost immediately. They didn't charge, didn't engage. They simply paralleled the Christian march, staying just out of reach, and began shooting. Arrows arced into the column from both sides. Most struck shields or armour harmlessly, but some found gaps. Horses screamed and fell. Sergeants and infantry, less well armoured than the knights, began taking casualties. The Crusader army found itself in a nightmare scenario. They couldn't stop because there was no water. They couldn't charge their tormentors because the Muslim cavalry would simply gallop away, then return to resume shooting. They had to maintain formation and continue marching, absorbing arrow fire, while the sun climbed higher and the temperature soared. By noon, the column had reached Turan. The wells were found destroyed, filled with stones. Whether Saladin's forces had sabotaged them, or whether they simply weren't adequate for such a large force remains debated, but the result was the same. No water. 6 miles from Tiberias, the army had to continue. Raymond of Tripoli, commanding the van, pushed forward, trying to reach the Sea of Galilee. But the rearguard, led by Balian of Ibelin, was falling behind, harassed constantly by Muslim cavalry. The column began to stretch out, gaps opening between formations. Guy ordered a halt to allow the army to close up. This decision, perhaps unavoidable, sealed their fate. By stopping, the Crusaders allowed Saladin to position his forces optimally. The Sultan's forces closed in from all sides, establishing a loose encirclement. As evening approached, the Christians found themselves surrounded, miles from water, with no clear path forward. Guy called another council. Raymond again urged an immediate forced march to Tiberias under cover of darkness. The army was still relatively intact, still capable of organised movement. If they could reach water, they could fight in the morning from a position of strength. But the knights and horses were exhausted. Many horses had already died from heat and thirst. The infantry was on the verge of collapse. Guy decided they would camp for the night at Hattin, rest and fight in the morning. It was perhaps the worst decision in Crusader military history. By camping at Hattin, Guy handed Saladin every advantage. The Muslim forces spent the night resting at springs around Tiberias, watering their horses, filling water skins. The Christians spent the night in torment, listening to their horses die, their throats too dry to even call out effectively. Then Saladin ordered his forces to set fires. The dry scrubland surrounding the Christian position erupted in flames. The wind blew smoke into the Crusader camp, adding suffocation to thirst. Knights who tried to sleep in armour found the metal heated by the fires around them, turning their protective shell into an oven. By dawn on July 4th, the Crusader army was defeated before the battle began. Men and horses were dehydrated, exhausted, demoralised. But they were still a formidable force. 1,200 knights in full armour, thousands of sergeants and infantry, all professional soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of combat. If they could form up and execute a proper charge, they still had a chance to break through to Tiberias. Guy ordered Raymond of Tripoli to lead the first charge. Raymond, commanding the vanguard with the flower of Galilee's nobility, formed his knights into proper formation. Despite thirst and exhaustion, the habits of a lifetime took over. Lances were levelled, spacing was maintained, and the formation began to move forward, building speed. This was the moment Saladin had orchestrated everything to achieve. His forces had manoeuvred the Crusaders to this exact place, this exact condition. Now his carefully trained cavalry would demonstrate whether years of preparation could stop the charge that had dominated battlefields for a century. The Ayyubid forces facing Raymond's charge formed into a concentrated mass. This wasn't their typical dispersed formation. Saladin had ordered specific units, his best horse archers, to mass directly in front of the oncoming knights. The Crusaders were probably no more than 200 yards away when the order to loose was given. What followed was every horse archer in the formation, firing simultaneously. Contemporary estimates suggest as many as 2,000 archers loosed at once. At 200 yards, even the best archer couldn't guarantee hitting a specific target. But 2,000 archers weren't aiming at individuals. They were creating a wall of projectiles that filled the air itself. The mathematical reality of massed archery becomes clear when you calculate the density of fire. If 2,000 archers each loose one arrow in roughly the same second, 2,000 projectiles are flying through a relatively narrow zone of space. The Crusader formation, tightly packed for maximum shock effect, presented a target area perhaps 50 yards wide and 10 yards deep. That's 500 square yards. 2,000 arrows distributed across 500 square yards means 4 arrows per square yard, or roughly 1 arrow for every 2 feet of space. For the Crusaders, it would have seemed like the air itself had turned to steel. The sky darkened. The sound, thousands of arrows cutting through air simultaneously, created a sound described by witnesses as a scream or a howl. Then the impacts began. The physics of an arrow striking armour are often misunderstood. Mail armour was quite effective against arrows, especially at longer ranges. A bodkin point arrow fired from 200 yards might penetrate mail, but it wouldn't penetrate with enormous force. Often the mail would slow the arrow enough that it inflicted only shallow wounds. Against plate armour, which some knights wore over vital areas, arrows were largely ineffective, but armour had gaps. The face, protected only by the narrow vision slit of a great helm. The armpits, where mail had to be lighter to allow arm movement. The back of the knees, the groin, the neck, and perhaps most importantly the horses. Destriers wore mail chanfrons protecting their faces and sometimes mail caparisons over their bodies, but this armour didn't cover everything. Their legs, their flanks, their bellies remained vulnerable. In a normal archery exchange where arrows arrive sporadically, most would strike armour and bounce off harmlessly. A knight might take a dozen hits and suffer nothing worse than bruises from the impacts. But in a simultaneous volley of this density, the mathematics changed. With an arrow striking every 2 feet of space, every single knight and horse in the formation took multiple hits, and probability dictated that some of those hits would find gaps. Horses collapsed, multiple arrows lodged in their flanks or legs. A destrier struck by 3 or 4 arrows would stumble, fall, or simply refuse to continue forward. Riders, even if personally uninjured, found themselves suddenly on collapsing mounts. In a tightly packed formation at full gallop, one falling horse created a cascade. The knight behind couldn't stop in time. His horse collided with the fallen animal, and he too went down. A wave of collisions rippled through the formation. Knights in the rear ranks, trying to maintain formation, had to dodge falling horses and men. The neat line became a chaos of struggling animals and armoured men trying desperately not to be trampled. Some knights managed to control their wounded horses, maintaining forward motion despite arrows protruding from their mounts. But the formation was broken. The wall of steel had shattered into individual riders, gaps appearing where moments before there had been a solid line. The charge didn't stop completely. Many knights, through skill or luck, maintained their mounts and continued forward. But they weren't charging anymore. They were individual riders, scattered, separated from their comrades, no longer presenting the unified shock front that made the Crusader charge devastating. And then the Ayyubid cavalry did something the Crusaders didn't expect. They scattered. Units to the left and right simply wheeled away, opening a corridor. Raymond and the knights who had maintained momentum found themselves charging through an empty space. There was nothing to hit, nothing to strike with their lances. They were galloping at full speed through a gap in the enemy line, their momentum carrying them forward, unable to stop. Behind them, the gap closed. Ayyubid cavalry wheeled back, reforming behind the Crusader vanguard, cutting them off from the main army. Raymond's charge had succeeded in breaking through the enemy line, but it had succeeded too well. They were now on the wrong side of Saladin's army, separated from their comrades, unable to return without charging through the entire Saracen force again. For the main Crusader body, still on the slopes of Hattin, the situation had become critical. The vanguard was gone, either scattered by the volley or vanished in pursuit of an enemy that had simply parted before them. The army's best shock unit, the northern barons who had trained together for years, was no longer on the battlefield. Saladin immediately pressed the advantage. His forces closed in from all directions. Now the archery wasn't massed volleys but continuous fire. Individual archers would approach the Christian lines, loose several arrows, then retreat before a countercharge could develop. It was death by 1,000 cuts. arrows constantly striking the Crusader formation from every direction. The True Cross, Christianity's holiest relic in the Levant, stood at the centre of the Crusader position. Guy ordered the army to contract around it, forming a defensive circle. The knights dismounted, realizing their horses were too exhausted and too vulnerable to arrows to be useful. In full armour, on foot, in the heat of a Middle Eastern July, they prepared to fight for their lives. The battle devolved into a grinding attrition. Crusader infantry, particularly the crossbowmen, attempted to drive off the Saracen horse archers. Crossbows had superior range and power compared to ordinary bows, and at 150 yards, a crossbow bolt could punch through mail armour with relative ease. But crossbows were slow to reload, managing perhaps 2 shots per minute, compared to the 15 or 20 a horse archer could loose. The Ayyubid cavalry simply stayed outside effective crossbow range, maintaining a distance where their composite bows could still reach the Crusaders, but return fire was ineffective. When crossbowmen advanced to close the range, cavalry would wheel away, maintaining distance. When the crossbowmen retreated back to the main formation, the cavalry would close again. By mid-morning, the situation was hopeless. Hundreds of Crusaders lay dead or wounded. The horses were dead or dying, making any coordinated cavalry action impossible. The infantry, already exhausted from the previous day's march, were collapsing from heat and thirst. Guy ordered a final desperate charge. The knights, dismounted, would advance in formation toward the springs of Hattin visible below. It was a forlorn hope. Armoured men on foot trying to cross open ground under constant arrow fire. They made it perhaps 300 yards before the formation disintegrated. Men simply couldn't continue. They collapsed from heat exhaustion, fell from wounds, or broke, and ran individually trying to reach water. Saladin's forces closed in for the final phase. Cavalry charged into the disintegrating Crusader formation, cutting down men too exhausted to resist effectively. Within an hour it was over. The True Cross was captured. King Guy was captured. Raynald of Châtillon was captured and personally executed by Saladin for his years of raiding and oath-breaking. Gerard de Ridefort and nearly every significant Crusader noble was either captured or killed. Of the 20,000 Crusaders who marched from Safaria, fewer than 3,000 escaped. Raymond of Tripoli, separated from the main body during the initial charge, managed to break free and flee north with perhaps a few hundred knights. The rest of the army was simply destroyed. The kingdom of Jerusalem's last field army had been annihilated. Historians have debated for centuries what exactly happened during that first volley that broke Raymond's charge. The sources are limited and sometimes contradictory. Muslim chroniclers, celebrating Saladin's greatest victory, emphasized the skill of the archers and the wisdom of the Sultan's tactics. Crusader sources, written by survivors of the defeat, focused on the thirst, the heat, the strategic failures that led to the disaster. But certain facts are clear. A coordinated volley of massed archery struck the Crusader vanguard during their charge. This volley disrupted the formation sufficiently that the charge lost its shock power, and once the formation broke, the battle was effectively decided. Everything that followed was denouement, the inevitable conclusion of a tactical situation that had already been resolved in those few seconds when steel arrows met steel armour. The long-term consequences of Hattin rippled across the Middle Ages. With Jerusalem's army destroyed, Saladin captured Jerusalem itself 3 months later. Nearly every Crusader stronghold in the Levant fell in the following year. The disaster triggered the Third Crusade, bringing Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany to the Holy Land in an attempt to reclaim what had been lost. But the military balance had shifted permanently. Never again would Frankish heavy cavalry dominate Middle Eastern battlefields with the casual supremacy they had enjoyed in the early Crusades. The myth of invincibility had been shattered at Hattin, and both sides knew it. For European military doctrine, Hattin represented a harsh lesson in the limits of heavy cavalry. The charge remained a powerful tactic, but it was no longer a guaranteed battle winner. Commanders learned they needed infantry support, missile troops, and tactical flexibility. The evolution toward combined arms warfare, where different troop types supported each other rather than one arm dominating, accelerated. For Islamic military thought, Hattin validated centuries of steppe warfare tradition. The composite bow and horse archery tactics had proven they could defeat even the most heavily armoured European knights when employed correctly. The key was refusing to meet the charge head-on, using mobility and firepower to disrupt the formation before it could develop its full shock power. The battle also highlighted the importance of logistics and strategic positioning. Saladin's victory was ultimately won before the fighting began, through careful choice of battlefield and timing that ensured the Crusaders would fight under the worst possible conditions. The tactical excellence of his horse archers in executing the volley that broke the charge was impressive, but it would have been irrelevant if the Crusaders had been fresh, well-watered, and fighting from defensible terrain. Modern analysis using computer simulations and archaeological evidence has provided new insights into the mechanics of medieval archery and armoured combat. Tests with replica composite bows and period-accurate arrows have demonstrated their effectiveness against armour at various ranges. Tests with mail armour show that while it provides good protection, it's not impenetrable, especially to high-quality armour-piercing arrows at relatively close range. Most significantly, modern analysis has confirmed what medieval commanders knew intuitively, that the vulnerability of horses was often more critical than the vulnerability of riders. A knight without a horse was just an armoured infantryman, strong but slow, powerful but vulnerable to being surrounded and overwhelmed. At Hattin, the volley killed or disabled enough horses that the formation could not maintain cohesion, and without cohesion, the charge had no power. The single volley that broke the Crusader charge at Hattin was the culmination of three factors converging at exactly the right moment. First, the strategic situation that placed the Crusaders in desperate circumstances, forced to charge or die of thirst. Second, the tactical skill of Ayyubid commanders who positioned their forces to deliver maximum firepower at the critical moment. Third, the technical excellence of horse archers whose years of training allowed them to execute a coordinated mass volley with devastating precision. Remove any one of those factors, and the battle might have ended differently. If the Crusaders had been well rested and positioned at Safaria as Raymond advised, they could have refused battle or fought from strength. If the Ayyubid archers had been less skilled, the volley might have been ineffective against armoured opponents. If Saladin's tactical control had been less precise, his forces might have scattered before the charge, as they had in earlier battles, allowing the Crusaders to pursue and destroy dispersed units. But all three factors aligned perfectly. The result was the most decisive Muslim victory of the Crusades, the battle that destroyed the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military power and shifted the balance of power in the Levant for generations. Today, the horns of Hattin rise above the Sea of Galilee much as they did in 1187. The site is marked with monuments commemorating the battle. Israeli archaeologists have found arrowheads, armour fragments, and other artefacts in the surrounding area, physical evidence of the desperate fighting that occurred there over 8 centuries ago. Standing at the site, looking toward Tiberias and the Sea of Galilee visible in the distance, the strategic situation becomes clear. The Crusaders could see water. They were only 6 miles from salvation. But Saladin's forces stood between them and survival, and when they tried to break through, 2,000 composite bows spoke in unison. The arrows that flew that morning carried more than steel points. They carried centuries of steppe warfare tradition, decades of Saladin's careful military preparation, and the accumulated skill of thousands of horse archers who had trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. When they struck, they didn't just break a charge. They broke the military supremacy that had sustained the Crusader states for 90 years. In the histories of warfare, certain moments stand as pivots, points where the trajectory of conflict shifted decisively. The Greek phalanx at Marathon, the English longbowmen at Agincourt, the French cavalry at Waterloo. Hattin belongs among these legendary engagements, not because it was the largest or bloodiest battle, but because it demonstrated a fundamental truth of warfare. Superior tactics, properly prepared and executed, can overcome superior equipment and individual valour. The Frankish knights at Hattin were brave. They were well equipped. They were professional warriors with years of training. But they charged into a tactical situation carefully orchestrated by a commander who understood their strengths and weaknesses better than they understood themselves. And when they charged into that volley of arrows, when 2,000 composite bows released their missiles simultaneously, courage and armour were not enough. The scream of arrows cutting through air that morning was the sound of an era ending. The age of Crusader military dominance died on the slopes of Hattin, killed by Turkish bows in the hands of men who had mastered their craft through generations of tradition and practice. Saladin's victory was total, but he showed mercy to most of the captured knights, ransoming them or releasing them after extracting oaths not to fight again. Only Raynald of Châtillon, whose violations of truces and massacres of prisoners had made him personally hated, was executed. This mercy was strategic. Saladin wanted to be known as a noble opponent, not a butcher. But it was also practical. Dead knights couldn't be ransomed, and ransoms represented significant wealth flowing from Europe to the Middle East. The military lessons of Hattin echoed through subsequent centuries. European commanders became more cautious about committing to charges against prepared positions. They developed combined arms tactics where infantry and cavalry supported each other. They paid more attention to logistics, recognizing that an army without water or supplies was defeated regardless of its fighting prowess. Muslim commanders, emboldened by Saladin's success, refined their tactics further. The composite bow remained the primary weapon of cavalry forces in the Middle East for centuries, not being fully superseded until gunpowder weapons became predominant. The tactical doctrine of harassment, feigned flight, and massed archery volleys became standard in Islamic military thought. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Hattin was psychological. The battle proved that European military superiority was not inevitable, that superior numbers, equipment, and individual fighting skill could be overcome by superior tactics and strategic positioning. This knowledge spread throughout the medieval world, changing how armies prepared for and fought their battles. In the end, the Battle of Hattin was won by the volley that broke the charge. Everything else, the heat, the thirst, the strategic mistakes, the tactical skill, all of it converged in that single moment when 2,000 arrows filled the air and the Crusader formation shattered. That volley lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but its effects resonated for centuries, changing the course of Crusader history and demonstrating the deadly effectiveness of the composite bow in the hands of masters. The Ayyubid archers who loosed their arrows that morning were professional soldiers, trained from childhood, executing tactics their commanders had practiced and refined over years of warfare. They weren't lucky, they weren't blessed by providence, they were simply very good at their craft, and they were led by a commander who understood how to employ their skills for maximum effect. When the last arrow fell and the dust cleared, the most powerful Crusader army ever assembled in the East lay, broken on the slopes of Hattin. And the weapon that broke them, the composite bow, had proven once again that mobility, firepower, and tactical skill could defeat even the most heavily armoured opponents when conditions were right and execution was perfect. The thunder of Crusader cavalry charges would echo across other battlefields in the years to come. But after Hattin, that thunder was always tinged with uncertainty. The knowledge that arrows could break what armour protected, that tactics could defeat strength, that a single volley, perfectly timed and precisely executed, could shatter an army and change the fate of kingdoms. The kingdom of Jerusalem never recovered from Hattin. Within days of the battle, Saladin's forces swept across the Levant like a tide that had been held back for decades and suddenly released. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. With the field army destroyed and nearly every fighting man either dead or captured, there was no one left to defend the fortresses and cities that dotted the Crusader states. Acre fell on July 10th, barely a week after the battle. The city's garrison, knowing no relief force existed, negotiated surrender terms. Saladin, flush with victory and eager to maintain momentum, was generous. The garrison was allowed to march out with their possessions and travel to Tyre, one of the few cities that remained in Crusader hands. Jaffa fell on July 26th, Sidon on July 29th, Beirut on August 6th. Each city fell with minimal resistance, the garrison's understanding that holding out was pointless suicide. The fortresses that had taken decades to build and had cost thousands of lives to defend were surrendered after token resistance or none at all. By September, Saladin stood before Jerusalem itself, the holy city, the symbolic and spiritual heart of the Crusader kingdom. The prize that had justified 2 centuries of warfare between Christianity and Islam was defended by fewer than 24 knights and perhaps 6,000 infantry, cobbled together from refugees, townsmen, and anyone else capable of holding a weapon. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few nobles to escape Hattin, commanded the defence. He faced an impossible situation. Saladin's army numbered over 20,000, battle-hardened veterans fresh from their greatest victory. The walls of Jerusalem were strong, but walls required defenders, and Balian simply didn't have enough men to properly garrison the fortifications. The siege lasted 2 weeks. Saladin's engineers brought up siege equipment, catapults and trebuchets, and began battering the walls. Mining operations began, sappers digging beneath the fortifications to collapse them. Archers on siege towers poured arrows into the defenders, the same composite bows that had broken the Crusader charge now turned against city walls. On October 2nd, 1187, Balian negotiated surrender. The terms were remarkably generous. The inhabitants would be ransomed rather than enslaved. Those who could pay would go free. Those who couldn't would be given time to raise funds or find sponsors. Saladin personally paid the ransom for thousands who couldn't afford it, a gesture of magnanimity that contrasted sharply with the Crusader massacre that had accompanied the city's capture in 1099. The loss of Jerusalem shook Western Europe to its core. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the news. His successor, Gregory X, immediately called for a new crusade. The most powerful monarchs in Christendom responded. Richard V of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all took the cross, pledging to reclaim Jerusalem. The Third Crusade that resulted was one of the largest military expeditions of the medieval period. But it's notable that the tactics employed by these later crusaders were substantially different from those used before Hattin. Richard the Lionheart, in particular, showed he had learned the lessons of the disaster. At the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, Richard faced Saladin with an army perhaps a third the size of the Muslim force, but Richard had organised his army into a combined arms formation that specifically countered the tactics that had proven so devastating at Hattin. Infantry marched on the outside of the formation, protecting the cavalry in the centre. Crossbowmen walked backwards, maintaining covering fire against harassing horse archers. The cavalry remained in tight formation, not charging until Richard judged the moment perfect. When Saladin's forces attacked, trying to break the Crusader formation with archery and feigned charges, Richard's infantry absorbed the arrows behind their shields. The crossbowmen, protected by the infantry, drove off horse archers that came too close. The cavalry, fresh and unexhausted, waited. For hours the armies marched and fought simultaneously, the Crusaders advancing toward Arsuf while Saladin's forces attempted to break their formation. Muslim arrows fell like rain, but the interlocked shields of the infantry prevented the kind of casualties that might break morale. Several times groups of knights attempted to charge without orders, frustrated by the defensive posture, but Richard's discipline held. Then, late in the day, Richard saw his opportunity. Part of Saladin's line had committed too deeply, pressing close to the Crusader formation. Richard unleashed his cavalry, not in a wild charge but in a controlled, coordinated assault at a specific weak point. The impact was devastating. The Muslim forces at that point, surprised by the sudden aggression after hours of defensive fighting, broke. The charge didn't pursue too far, Richard recalled his knights, before they could scatter and be isolated. But the psychological impact was significant. Saladin's army withdrew, having failed to stop the Crusader advance. Arsuf demonstrated that the Crusader charge could still be effective, but only when employed as part of a combined arms doctrine, not as the sole tactical approach. Richard had learned what Guy de Lusignan never understood, that cavalry was a weapon to be used at the right moment, not a hammer to be thrown at every problem. But even Richard, despite his tactical skill and his victory at Arsuf, could not recapture Jerusalem. He besieged it twice but never assaulted the walls. The logistical challenges were too great, the defenders too numerous, and the political situation in Europe required his return. The Third Crusade ended with Jerusalem still in Muslim hands, the Crusaders holding only a narrow coastal strip. The military balance established at Hattin persisted. European forces could win tactical victories, could hold fortified positions, could maintain coastal cities supplied by sea, but they could not reconquer the interior. The era of Crusader expansion was over, replaced by a defensive posture that lasted until the Crusader states finally collapsed entirely in the late 13th century. The tactical lessons of Hattin spread far beyond the Middle East. Military treatises written in the decades after the battle discussed the importance of combined arms tactics, the vulnerability of cavalry to massed archery, the critical nature of logistics and strategic positioning. European military doctrine evolved, incorporating these lessons. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century provided a terrifying demonstration that the lessons of Hattin had not been fully absorbed. Mongol armies, employing horse archery tactics even more refined than the Ayyubids, devastated European forces in Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, Mongol horse archers destroyed a combined Polish-German army using tactics that would have been familiar to Saladin's commanders. Feigned retreats, harassment, refusal to engage in close combat until the enemy formation broke, all the elements that had worked at Hattin. Only the death of the great Khan Ugadi, requiring Mongol commanders to return east for the succession crisis, saved Western Europe from the same fate that befell the Crusader kingdom. But the psychological impact persisted. European commanders recognized that their traditional tactics were vulnerable to mobile horse archers, and they adjusted accordingly. The evolution of European military forces in the late medieval period reflects these lessons. Infantry became more professional and better equipped. Crossbowmen and later longbowmen became integral parts of armies, not auxiliaries. Cavalry tactics became more flexible, with knights learning to fight dismounted when appropriate, and to coordinate with other arms rather than charging independently. In the Islamic world, Hattin became a legendary victory, celebrated in poetry and histories. Saladin himself became a hero figure, the Muslim commander who had reclaimed Jerusalem and defeated the Crusaders at the height of their power. His tactics were studied and emulated by subsequent generations of Muslim commanders. But there was also recognition that Hattin represented a specific set of circumstances that might not be repeatable. The Crusaders had made catastrophic strategic errors. They had fought under the worst possible conditions. They had failed to adapt their tactics to the situation. Saladin had orchestrated the perfect tactical setup. His victory was earned through superior generalship, but it was also opportunistic, taking advantage of enemy mistakes. Later battles between Crusaders and Muslim forces were more evenly matched. At the Battle of Jaffa in 1192, a tiny force of Crusaders under Richard the Lionheart successfully defended against a much larger Muslim army by using proper tactics, positioning infantry to protect flanks, and using cavalry charges only at decisive moments. The Crusaders won that engagement despite being outnumbered 10-1, proving that tactical skill could work both ways. The composite bow that had been so decisive at Hattin continued to evolve. By the 13th century, Muslim armies were producing bows of even greater power and refinement. Some examples tested by modern archaeologists have draw weights exceeding 150 pounds, putting them among the most powerful hand bows ever created. The arrows became more specialized, with different head designs for different targets and purposes. But the bow was also reaching its practical limits. The human body can only draw so much weight, fire so many arrows per minute, achieve so much accuracy. Improvements beyond the 12th century composite bow were marginal. Meanwhile, other weapons technologies were advancing rapidly. The crossbow, in particular, evolved dramatically in the 13th and 14th centuries. Mechanical spanning devices allowed much heavier draw weights, producing weapons that could penetrate almost any armour at practical range. A trained archer with a composite bow was still more effective in most situations, but crossbowmen required far less training and could be recruited and equipped much more quickly. Then came gunpowder. The first firearms appeared in Europe in the early 14th century, crude hand cannons that were more dangerous to their operators than to enemies. But the technology improved rapidly. By the 15th century, firearms were becoming practical military weapons. By the 16th century, they were dominant. The composite bow lingered longer in the Islamic world and Central Asia, where horse archery traditions remained strong. Ottoman armies still employed significant numbers of horse archers into the 17th century. But even they eventually transitioned to firearms, recognizing that while a master archer was superior to a musketeer in individual skill, an army of musketeers could be trained in months, while an army of archers required decades. The last major military use of composite bows in large numbers was probably in the 18th century, by Central Asian peoples resisting Russian expansion. By the 19th century, the weapon had become obsolete, except for hunting and ceremonial purposes. The skill required to craft and use them was fading, preserved only by a handful of traditional craftsmen. Modern attempts to recreate period-accurate composite bows have proven challenging. The materials are difficult to source, water buffalo horn is not widely available, fish glue must be made using traditional methods that have been largely forgotten. The construction process requires knowledge passed down through apprenticeships, written instructions are insufficient. Several modern bowyers have successfully recreated functional composite bows, but they acknowledge that their products likely fall short of the best examples produced by medieval Turkish or Persian craftsmen who had perfected their art over generations. Testing these recreation bows against replica armour has provided valuable data about medieval warfare. The bows are indeed capable of penetrating mail armour at close range, especially with armour-piercing bodkin points. Against plate armour, they are less effective but can still find gaps. Most significantly, tests confirm that massed volleys dramatically increase the probability of disabling hits, validating the tactical approach employed at Hattin. The psychological impact of facing massed archery has been harder to recreate in modern experiments. Test subjects wearing armour and facing blunt arrows report significant stress, even knowing they are in no real danger. The sound of arrows striking armour, the impact vibrations, the visual experience of seeing projectiles converging on you, all combine to create intense psychological pressure. Extrapolating to actual combat, where arrows are lethal and the stakes are life and death, helps explain why so many formations broke under sustained archery fire. Modern military analysis of Hattin often focuses on the decision-making process that led to the disaster. Guy de Lusignan's choice to march from Safaria is studied in military academies as an example of how political pressure can override sound military judgment. The trap Saladin set, forcing an opponent to choose between political humiliation and tactical disaster, is recognized as a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The battle also illustrates the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. Saladin knew the terrain intimately. He knew where water was and wasn't. He knew how far the Crusaders could march in a day under various conditions. He had accurate intelligence about their numbers and composition. The Crusaders, conversely, seem to have had poor intelligence about Saladin's dispositions and intentions. This information asymmetry was nearly as important as the tactical execution. Logistics, often overlooked in romantic accounts of medieval warfare, was the foundation of Saladin's victory. He had arranged supply depots, ensured his army could access water, planned for the movement and maintenance of tens of thousands of men and horses. The Crusaders, departing from Safaria, apparently had no viable logistics plan for fighting miles from water in summer heat. This failure made everything else inevitable. The evolution of military thought between the First Crusade and Hattin demonstrates how armies learn and adapt. The early Crusaders succeeded partly because they were unknown quantities. Muslim commanders didn't know how to counter the heavy cavalry charge because they had never faced it before. By 1187, commanders like Saladin had decades of experience fighting Franks. They understood the strengths and weaknesses of European tactics intimately. They had developed counters and had the discipline and training to execute them. This pattern of initial tactical dominance followed by adaptation and counter-tactics repeats throughout military history. The English longbowmen dominated 14th century battlefields until enemies learned not to charge them head-on. Spanish tercios dominated the 16th century until mobile artillery and linear tactics countered their deep formations. German blitzkrieg dominated early World War II until combined arms doctrines and strategic depth blunted its effectiveness. Hattin fits this pattern perfectly. The Crusader charge had dominated for 90 years. Then an opponent emerged who understood how to counter it, who had the forces and skill to execute that counter, and who engineered a situation where the counter could be employed with maximum effectiveness. The result was catastrophic for the side that had previously dominated, but it was also predictable in hindsight. Military dominance never lasts forever because enemies learn and adapt. The human stories behind Hattin are often lost in discussions of tactics and strategy. 20,000 men marched from Safaria. Fewer than 3,000 returned. Each one of those lost lives represented a person with hopes, fears, families, histories. The same is true of Saladin's forces, though they suffered far fewer casualties. Wars are ultimately about people, not abstract tactical principles. Among the survivors, Raymond of Tripoli returned to his wife after she was released by Saladin. He died the following year, reportedly still tormented by guilt over his advice being ignored and the resulting disaster. Some sources claim he died of pleurisy, others suggest grief and regret broke his health. Whether he could have changed the outcome by arguing more forcefully remains a historical what-if. Guy de Lusignan, captured at Hattin, was eventually released by Saladin after promising never to bear arms against him again. Guy immediately broke this oath, arguing it was extracted under duress and therefore not binding. He participated in the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, though he was politically marginalised, his failure at Hattin having destroyed his credibility. He ended his days as King of Cyprus, a title granted by Richard the Lionheart as consolation for his loss of Jerusalem's crown. Among the common soldiers and knights, many were ransomed and returned home. Others died in captivity. Some converted to Islam and joined Saladin's forces, apostasy driven by pragmatism or desperation. The fates of most remain unknown, recorded in no chronicle, remembered by no one. They marched to Hattin and never came home, and that is all history records. Saladin himself enjoyed only 6 more years of life after his greatest triumph. He died in 1193, his empire immediately fragmenting as his sons and relatives fought over the succession. The unity he had created, so essential to his victories, died with him. Within a generation, the Ayyubid realm was divided into squabbling principalities, recreating the fragmentation that had made the First Crusade successful. The Third Crusade had weakened Saladin more than Western accounts sometimes suggest. Richard's campaigns, while not reconquering Jerusalem, had retaken much of the coast and demonstrated that well-led Crusader forces remained formidable. Saladin's attempts to dislodge Richard from Jaffa and other positions had failed, costing men and resources. The great Sultan died exhausted, his treasury empty, his dream of permanently expelling the Crusaders unrealised. But Hattin remained his greatest achievement. In the century after his death, as dynasties rose and fell, as crusades came and went, as the political map of the Middle East was redrawn repeatedly, Hattin stood as a singular moment when everything changed. It was the high watermark of Crusader power and the beginning of their long decline. It demonstrated that European military superiority was contingent, not absolute. And it showed that the composite bow, in the hands of masters, guided by brilliant tactics, could defeat the most advanced military technology of the age. The battlefield itself has been excavated multiple times over the past century. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of artifacts, arrowheads, armour fragments, coins, personal items. Each discovery adds small details to our understanding of the battle. The distribution of arrowheads, for instance, confirms that archery fire was concentrated in specific areas, consistent with accounts of massed volleys. The types of armour fragments found show that both sides employed sophisticated protective gear. One particularly poignant discovery was a cluster of remains, knights and their horses fallen together, buried where they fell. Forensic analysis showed multiple arrow impacts on the bones, confirming that these men died under sustained archery fire. The arrows had struck from multiple directions, indicating they were surrounded when they fell. They probably represented a group that tried to hold formation after the initial charge broke, fighting until overwhelmed. They died doing their duty, soldiers to the end, and they were buried with honour by whoever controlled the battlefield after the fighting ended. Such discoveries remind us that behind the grand narratives of tactics and strategy, battles are deeply human experiences. For the men who fought at Hattin, this wasn't an interesting historical event. It was the most terrifying experience of their lives. Hours of desperate combat under brutal conditions, watching comrades die, wondering if the next arrow had their name on it. For the Ayyubid horse archers who loosed that famous volley, it was the culmination of lifetimes of training, the moment when years of practice manifested in perfect execution. For Saladin, watching his battle plan unfold successfully, it must have been both exhilarating and sobering, a great victory but one purchased with human lives. The Battle of Hattin stands as one of medieval warfare's most decisive engagements, a hinge moment when the trajectory of an entire region's history shifted. It demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of combined arms tactics, the importance of strategic positioning and logistics, and the vulnerability of even the most elite forces when caught in unfavourable conditions. But most specifically, it demonstrated what a single volley of massed archery could achieve. 2,000 composite bows drawn by masters of their craft, releasing their arrows simultaneously at a Crusader formation already weakened by thirst and heat and harassment. For perhaps 5 seconds the air filled with steel. When those arrows fell, they brought down more than knights and horses. They brought down a century of military dominance. They brought down the kingdom of Jerusalem. They brought down the certainty that European heavy cavalry was invincible. The archers who loosed that volley probably never fully understood the historical significance of their action. They were following orders, executing tactics they had practiced countless times, but in doing so, they changed history. They proved that the charge could be stopped, that armour had limits, that mobility and firepower, properly employed, could defeat shock and steel. That volley echoed across the centuries, influencing military doctrine, changing how armies fought, teaching lessons that would be learned and relearned in conflicts yet to come. When the last arrow fell and the dust settled on July 4th, 1187, the age of Crusader dominance had ended. The thunder of hooves and the crash of the charge would sound again on other battlefields, but never again with the same sense of invincibility, the same certainty of victory. Hattin had taught a lesson written in blood and steel, that in war nothing is invincible, no tactic is unbeatable, and a single moment of perfect execution can shatter armies and change the course of empires.